He never forgave himself for what he did, until a cat appeared at his gate. The autumn morning arrived grey and uninviting in Charlottesville, Virginia, carrying with it the familiar bite of October air that seemed to seep through every crack in Graham Ellison's weathered Victorian house. The wind rattled the windows with an insistence that matched the restless thoughts circling in his mind, sending dried leaves skittering across the neglected lawn like whispered accusations he couldn't escape. Inside, Graham moved through his morning routine with mechanical precision, the same path from bedroom to kitchen, the same reheated coffee from yesterday's pot, the same avoidance of the mirror that hung crooked in the hallway. The house felt too big and too small all at once, its rooms echoing with the hollow sound of a life lived in isolation. Dust motes danced in the thin streams of light that managed to pierce through the heavy curtains he kept perpetually drawn, as if sunlight itself might reveal the shame he worked so hard to hide. The smell of damp wood and stale air had become his constant companion, a scent so familiar he barely noticed it anymore. But visitors would have, if he'd had any. The neighbors had long since given up their polite waves and concerned glances, walking past his property with the deliberate blindness reserved for uncomfortable truths. Graham had become the neighborhood ghost, the cautionary tale whispered about, but never directly addressed. He settled into his worn leather chair, the one that had molded itself to his frame over countless mornings of solitude, and stared at the stack of unopened mail on the side table. Bills mostly, and promotional flyers for local events he'd never attend. Beneath it all lay a letter that had arrived 3 months ago, his brother David's handwriting still visible through the envelope's transparent window. Graham's chest tightened at the sight of it, the familiar weight of regret settling like a stone in his stomach. The argument had happened 2 years ago, over something that seemed monumental at the time, but now felt insignificant compared to the silence that followed. Harsh words about their father's will, accusations of selfishness and greed, the kind of verbal wounds that fester when left untreated. Graham had been the one to walk away first, his pride intact but his family fractured. He'd told himself David would call eventually, that time would smooth over their rough edges as it always had before. But David never called, and Graham never found the courage to pick up the phone. The coffee had grown cold in his hands when a soft sound from outside caught his attention, a rhythmic tapping against the front gate that seemed too deliberate to be the wind. Graham set down his mug and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer through the gap between the fabric and the frame. There, sitting with perfect posture beside his rusted iron gate, was a cat. Not just any cat, but one that seemed to command attention despite its stillness. Its fur was a rich silver grey, the colour of storm clouds touched by moonlight, and it wore a collar that had seen better days, leather worn soft by time and weather. Even from his window, Graham could see the intensity of its amber eyes, fixed not on the street or the passing cars, but directly on his house, on him. The cat didn't move when a delivery truck rumbled past, didn't flinch when Mrs. Henderson's terrier yapped from behind her fence. It simply sat, patient and unwavering, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment for years. Graham let the curtain fall back into place and returned to his chair, but the image lingered. When he looked again an hour later, the cat remained in the same position, unbothered by the light drizzle that had begun to fall. By afternoon, when the rain had intensified and the temperature had dropped, the animal was still there, now thoroughly soaked, but showing no signs of seeking shelter elsewhere. "Stubborn thing," Graham muttered, though he found himself checking the window more frequently as the day wore on. As evening approached and the streetlights flickered to life, casting long shadows across the wet pavement, Graham finally ventured onto his front porch. The cat looked up at his approach, and Graham was struck by the intelligence in those amber eyes, not the simple awareness of a typical house cat, but something deeper, more knowing. "You can't stay here," Graham said, his voice rusty from disuse. "This isn't a good place for anyone." The cat tilted its head slightly, a gesture so human-like it made Graham take a step back. He noticed the nameplate on the collar then, tarnished silver catching the porchlight. "Noxley." "Noxley," Graham repeated, testing the unusual name on his tongue. "Someone's missing you, aren't they?" "Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow." But even as he said it, he could see the cat was well fed. its coat healthy despite being rain-soaked. This wasn't a stray seeking food or shelter. It was an animal with purpose, though what that purpose might be remained a mystery. Graham retreated inside, but sleep eluded him that night. Every sound from outside made him wonder if the cat had finally moved on, and he caught himself looking out the window more than once to check. Each time, Noxley remained at his post, curled now against the gate but still clearly visible under the amber streetlight. The next morning brought crisp air and brilliant sunshine, the kind of October day that usually reminded Graham of everything he was missing by staying inside. But today, his first thought was of the cat. He rushed to the window, half expecting to find the gate empty, but Noxley sat there as if he'd never moved, his silver coat dry and somehow perfectly groomed, despite the previous night's rain. This is ridiculous, Graham told himself, but he found a can of tuna in his pantry anyway, a remnant from a time when he'd occasionally cooked real meals. He opened it with shaking hands, the sharp scent making his own empty stomach growl, and carried it outside on a chipped saucer. Noxley watched his approach with those unnerving amber eyes, but didn't move until Graham had set the dish down and retreated several steps. Only then did the cat rise, stretch with feline elegance and approach the offering. He ate with dignified precision, as if this had been expected rather than hoped for. When the dish was empty, Noxley sat back and regarded Graham with what could only be described as approval. For the first time in months, Graham felt the unfamiliar warmth of being useful to another living being. "I suppose you'll be back tomorrow," Graham said, more to himself than to the cat. Noxley's slow blink seemed to confirm it. As Graham turned to go back inside, he paused. The simple act of providing food had stirred something in him he'd thought permanently buried, a sense of purpose, however small. For just a moment, the weight in his chest felt lighter, replaced by something that might have been hope if he'd dared to name it. But hope, Graham knew from bitter experience, was a dangerous thing. It made you believe in possibilities that didn't exist, in second chances that never came. Better to stay numb, to keep the walls up, to expect nothing. Still, as he closed the door behind him, Graham found himself already planning what he might offer Noxley tomorrow, and for the first time in 2 years, he slept through the night without dreams of the brother he'd lost to his own stubborn pride. The third morning arrived with the kind of persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into everything. The wood siding of Graham's house, his aching joints, and the fabric of his increasingly fragile resolve to remain uninvolved with the mysterious cat. Yet there was Noxley, stationed at the gate as if Graham's yard had become his assigned territory, amber eyes bright despite the grey weather. This time, Graham didn't hesitate. He opened a can of salmon, slightly more expensive than the tuna, though he told himself it was simply because he'd run out of the cheaper option. As he approached the gate, Noxley rose and performed what Graham could only describe as a greeting bow, stretching his front legs and dipping his head in a gesture of acknowledgement that seemed almost ceremonial. "You're welcome," Graham found himself saying, then immediately felt foolish for talking to a cat as if it could understand the nuances of human politeness. But as the days passed, their morning routine became less awkward and more companionable. Noxley began to venture closer, eventually allowing Graham to observe him from just a few feet away. The cat's behavior was unlike any Graham had experienced. He didn't beg or rub against legs like typical strays. Instead, he maintained a respectful distance while somehow conveying gratitude and increasingly expectation. It was during the second week of their arrangement that Noxley made his first bold move. Graham had left the front door ajar while retrieving the empty food dish, and when he turned around, the cat was sitting just inside the threshold, looking around the entryway with what appeared to be professional assessment. "Oh no," Graham said, moving to block the cat's path further inside. "This is where we draw the line. Outside is one thing, but I can't have you thinking you live here." Noxley regarded him with those penetrating amber eyes, then deliberately turned and walked back outside, settling on the porch mat, as if to demonstrate his understanding of boundaries. But something in his posture suggested this was a strategic retreat rather than a defeat. The breakthrough came during a particularly fierce thunderstorm that struck Charlottesville with unusual intensity for mid-October. Graham paced his living room, genuinely worried about the cat's welfare as rain lashed against his windows and lightning illuminated the sky in stark, brief intervals. When he could no longer stand the anxiety, he grabbed an umbrella and ventured outside. He found Noxley huddled under the narrow overhang of his porch, dry but clearly uncomfortable. Without thinking, Graham scooped him up, surprised by how readily the cat accepted the handling, and carried him inside. "Just until the storm passes," he announced to his empty house, as if establishing the temporary nature of this arrangement would somehow protect him from getting too attached. Noxley explored the living room with methodical curiosity, sniffing corners and investigating furniture with the thoroughness of a home inspector. When he jumped onto Graham's reading chair, the one piece of furniture Graham considered truly his, Graham started to object, but the words died in his throat. The cat looked so perfectly at home there, as if the chair had been waiting for exactly this occupant. As the storm raged outside, Graham found himself really looking at his living space for the first time in months. Through Noxley's apparent evaluation, he saw the accumulation of neglect. Dust on surfaces, magazines stacked haphazardly, the general disorder of someone who'd stopped caring about his environment. It wasn't dirty exactly, but it wasn't the home of someone who expected visitors or took pride in his surroundings. "I suppose it's not much to look at," Graham said, settling onto his couch while Noxley claimed the chair. "But it serves its purpose." The cat's unwavering gaze seemed to question what exactly that purpose might be. When the storm finally passed, Graham expected Noxley to request immediate exodus, but the cat had curled up in the chair and appeared to be settling in for the night. Graham found himself reluctant to disturb this peaceful scene, and before he could talk himself out of it, he'd retrieved a soft towel from his linen closet and arranged it on the chair as an impromptu cat bed. "One night," he told Noxley firmly. "Then it's back to the porch arrangements." But one night became two, then three. Noxley's presence began to impose a structure on Graham's days that he hadn't realized he'd been missing. The cat expected breakfast at a reasonable hour, seemed to prefer dinner before sunset, and had definite opinions about when the house should be aired out, expressed through strategic positioning by windows and meaningful glances at the curtains. It was Noxley's interest in the garage that forced the first real confrontation with Graham's past. The cat had discovered the door to the attached garage and spent considerable time sitting in front of it, occasionally scratching at the base as if requesting entry. Graham had been avoiding that space for nearly 2 years, but Noxley's persistence finally wore down his resistance. The garage smelled of dust and motor oil, familiar scents that carried unwelcome memories. Graham's tools hung on pegboards exactly where he'd left them, and his workbench bore the accumulated debris of abandoned projects. But it was the wooden crate in the far corner that drew Noxley's immediate attention, the same crate Graham hadn't touched since the day of his argument with David. Noxley jumped onto the crate and settled there as if claiming a throne, his amber eyes fixed on Graham with unmistakable expectation. Graham's hands trembled as he approached, his heart rate accelerating despite the innocent nature of the cat's request. "There's nothing in there that matters anymore," Graham said, but his voice lacked conviction. The cat remained motionless, a silver-grey sentinel guarding secrets Graham had tried to bury. With movements that felt disconnected from his conscious will, Graham lifted the crate's hinged lid. Inside lay the remnants of his relationship with David, birthday cards never sent, printed emails he'd drafted but never finished, photographs from family gatherings that now felt like evidence from another lifetime. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper grown yellow with age, was the compass their father had given them to share during childhood camping trips. Graham lifted it with shaking hands, its brass surface tarnished but still functional. He remembered the fights they'd had over whose turn it was to carry it, how David had always claimed he was the better navigator, how they'd eventually learned to take turns without their father's intervention. The memory hit him with unexpected force, and he sank onto a nearby stool. The compass clutched against his chest. Noxley jumped down from the crate and approached, not quite touching but close enough that Graham could feel his warmth. "We were supposed to fix this," Graham whispered, more to himself than to the cat. "Brothers are supposed to forgive each other." For the first time since Noxley's arrival, Graham found himself crying, not the bitter tears of anger or self-pity that had occasionally overwhelmed him over the past 2 years, but something cleaner and more honest. Grief for what he'd lost, regret for his stubborn pride, and underneath it all, a longing for reconciliation that he'd been too afraid to acknowledge. Noxley remained nearby throughout Graham's breakdown, a steady presence that somehow made the emotional release feel safe rather than shameful. When the tears finally subsided, the cat had moved closer, near enough to touch if Graham chose to reach out. "You planned this, didn't you?" Graham asked, managing a weak smile. "Somehow you knew exactly what was in that crate." Noxley's slow blink could have been agreement or simple cat satisfaction, but either way, Graham felt something shift inside him. Not healing exactly, that would take much longer, but the first crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. That evening, for the first time in 2 years, Graham sat at his kitchen table with pen and paper, attempting to write a letter to David. The words came slowly, many false starts ending up in the trash can, but Noxley supervised the process from his new favorite perch on the windowsill, occasionally jumping down to walk across the paper when Graham's frustration threatened to overwhelm his progress. By bedtime, Graham had managed 3 sentences, not much, but a beginning. And as Noxley settled into his chair for the night, Graham felt the unfamiliar stirring of something that might eventually become hope, carefully tended and protected like a seedling emerging from winter ground. The next morning would bring new challenges, but for the first time in months, Graham looked forward to facing them with his unexpected companion by his side. The letter to David remained unfinished on Graham's kitchen table for 3 days, each attempted revision revealing how thoroughly he'd lost the ability to communicate beyond the basic necessities of solitary life. Noxley seemed to understand his frustration, often positioning himself strategically to block Graham's view of his laptop screen whenever he tried to escape into old work files, instead of facing the more difficult task of emotional honesty. It was during one such morning standoff, Noxley sprawled across the keyboard while Graham nursed his 3rd cup of coffee, that Mrs. Chen from next door appeared at his front window, peering through the gap in his curtains with undisguised curiosity. "Oh!" she exclaimed when Graham opened the door, her hand flying to her chest in apparent surprise. "I didn't expect... that is, I thought maybe no one was home. It's been so quiet over here." Graham realized with some embarrassment that this was the first time he'd spoken to a neighbor in over a year. Mrs. Chen was a small, energetic woman in her 70s who tended an impressive garden and seemed to know everyone's business within a 3-block radius. "I was wondering about the cat," she continued, gesturing toward Noxley, who had materialized at Graham's feet as if summoned for this exact conversation. "He's been sitting by your gate for weeks, and then I noticed he started going inside." "He's not mine," Graham said quickly, then felt compelled to add, "I mean, I've been feeding him, but I'm sure he belongs to someone." Mrs. Chen bent down to examine Noxley more closely, and the cat, with his uncanny ability to read social situations, approached her with tail held high in a gesture of greeting that immediately won her approval. "Such a handsome fellow," she murmured, scratching behind his ears. "And well cared for, certainly, but you know I've been asking around the neighborhood and no one seems to know where he came from." This information settled uneasily in Graham's stomach. He'd been operating under the assumption that Noxley would eventually return to his real family, that this companionship was temporary by nature. The possibility that the cat might be truly homeless, or worse, abandoned, opened up complications Graham wasn't sure he was ready to handle. "There's a community bulletin board at Riverside Market," Mrs. Chen continued. "You might post his photo there, see if anyone's missing him. Though," she paused, studying Graham with the kind of direct assessment that made him want to retreat inside. "He seems quite content here. Some animals know where they need to be." After she left, Graham found himself staring at Noxley with new uncertainty. The cat gazed back with his typical amber-eyed composure, as if to say that ownership papers were human concerns, irrelevant to the more important business of daily coexistence. The trip to Riverside Market represented Graham's first voluntary venture beyond his property line in months. He'd prepared for the expedition like a reconnaissance mission, choosing the least busy time of day and planning the quickest route to minimize human interaction. But Noxley had other ideas. Instead of waiting at home as Graham had instructed, the cat somehow managed to slip out during his departure and was sitting calmly in the passenger seat of Graham's car when he started the engine. No amount of coaxing could convince him to leave, and Graham eventually gave up, reasoning that having Noxley present might actually make the whole enterprise feel less daunting. Riverside Market turned out to be one of those aggressively cheerful neighborhood establishments where the produce was locally sourced and the staff knew customers' names and dietary restrictions. Graham approached the community board with military precision, pinning up a hastily composed found cat notice with a photo taken on his phone that morning. "Oh my goodness, is this Noxley?" Graham turned to find a young woman in her 30s examining his posting with obvious recognition. She wore the kind of bright, practical clothing that suggested either a teacher or a social worker, and her face lit up when she spotted the cat in Graham's arms. "So you know him?" Graham asked, his heart rate accelerating with what he told himself was relief, but felt suspiciously like disappointment. "Not exactly," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah Martinez. I coordinate the reading program at Riverside Community Church. Noxley used to visit us during our children's reading hours, just showed up one day and made himself at home. The kids absolutely loved him." Graham processed this information slowly. "Used to visit? He stopped coming about 3 weeks ago. We were all worried something had happened to him." Sarah's expression brightened. "But clearly he found a good situation. He looks wonderful." 3 weeks. Graham calculated backward and realized that was almost exactly when Noxley had first appeared at his gate. The coincidence seemed too precise to be accidental, though he couldn't imagine what chain of events might have led the cat from a church reading program to his particular doorstep. "The thing is," Sarah continued, "we never did figure out where he belonged. He just appeared one day, perfectly socialized and clearly well cared for, but no collar or identification. We assumed someone in the neighborhood owned him and he was just making rounds." This presented Graham with an unexpected dilemma. If Noxley wasn't truly lost, then keeping him might constitute theft. But if no one was actively searching for him and the cat had chosen Graham's home as his base of operations, then perhaps the arrangement was more legitimate than he'd dared to hope. "Would you like to bring him by the church sometime?" Sarah asked. "I know the reading group would love to see him again. We meet Wednesday evenings and Saturday mornings." Graham's immediate impulse was to decline. Social obligations were exactly what he'd been avoiding for the past 2 years, but Noxley chose that moment to purr loudly against his chest, a rumbling endorsement that somehow made refusal seem churlish. "I'll think about it," Graham heard himself saying, which was already more commitment than he'd made to any social activity in recent memory. The drive home passed in contemplative silence, broken only by Noxley's occasional commentary from the passenger seat. Graham found himself taking a longer route through downtown Charlottesville, noting changes to familiar streets and businesses that had occurred during his self-imposed isolation. The world had continued evolving without his participation, but it didn't seem as foreign or threatening as he'd imagined. That evening, as he finally completed the letter to David, a brief but honest note acknowledging his mistakes and expressing hope for eventual reconciliation, Graham made a decision that surprised him. He would take Noxley to the church reading program, not because he was ready to rejoin society, but because the cat clearly had connections and relationships that Graham had no right to sever. The decision felt both terrifying and liberating, like stepping off a cliff while trusting that someone had remembered to pack a parachute. Noxley, curled in his chair with the satisfied air of a diplomat who'd successfully negotiated a complex treaty, seemed to approve of this development. Wednesday evening couldn't arrive quickly enough, and yet when it did, Graham nearly lost his nerve entirely. He stood outside Riverside Community Church for 10 minutes, Noxley patient in his carrier, watching through the windows as children and adults gathered in what appeared to be the fellowship hall. The scene looked so normal, so wholesome, that Graham felt like an intruder before he'd even crossed the threshold. But Noxley had no such hesitations. The moment Graham opened the carrier inside the church, the cat emerged with the confidence of a celebrity making a planned appearance. Children squealed with delight, adults smiled with genuine pleasure, and Graham found himself swept into a circle of welcome that he'd forgotten could exist. "This is Graham," Sarah announced to the group. "He's been taking care of Noxley." And just like that, Graham had an identity beyond his mistakes, a role in the community that had nothing to do with his past failures and everything to do with his willingness to show up. It wasn't a complete transformation. He still felt the familiar weight of anxiety and self-doubt, but it was a beginning. As the evening progressed, and Noxley moved from lap to lap, listening to stories with the serious attention of a professional therapist, Graham realized that his cat companion had once again maneuvered him into exactly the situation he needed, whether he'd recognized it or not. For the first time in 2 years, Graham felt like he might actually belong somewhere. And that feeling, fragile as it was, seemed worth protecting. November arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if Charlottesville couldn't quite decide which season it wanted to embrace. Graham had settled into a routine that would have seemed impossible just a month earlier. Morning coffee with Noxley supervising from the windowsill, afternoon walks around the neighborhood that the cat somehow managed to orchestrate, and Wednesday evening reading sessions at the church, where he'd gradually progressed from silent observer to occasional participant. The transformation felt fragile, like a house of cards that might collapse at the first strong breeze. Graham tested his new equilibrium carefully, venturing slightly further from his comfort zone each day, but always with Noxley as his anchor, a constant presence that made the wider world feel navigable. It was during one of their neighborhood walks that they encountered Edwin Thornbury, a man whose careful solitude mirrored Graham's own. Edwin was perhaps 10 years older, with silver hair and the kind of precise posture that suggested either military service or academic life. He tended a small but meticulously maintained garden behind a brick cottage on Maple Street, and Graham had noticed him working there during their recent excursions. The meeting happened because Noxley, with his usual disregard for human social protocols, simply walked up to Edwin's gate and sat down, clearly expecting conversation to follow. Edwin looked up from his rose bushes with the startled expression of someone unused to interruption, but his face softened when he saw the cat. "Beautiful animal," Edwin said, setting down his pruning shears. "Very well behaved." "That's Noxley," Graham replied, feeling obligated to provide some explanation for their intrusion. "He has strong opinions about where we should walk." Edwin's smile suggested he understood something about the tyranny of pet preferences. "I had a cat once who insisted on daily tours of the entire block, turned me into quite the neighborhood gossip, whether I wanted to be or not." The conversation that followed was cautious on both sides. Two men who'd clearly practiced the art of emotional self-protection, but found themselves drawn into genuine exchange by Noxley's catalytic presence. Edwin, it turned out, was a retired English professor who'd moved to Charlottesville after his wife's death 3 years earlier. He knew the church reading program and had considered joining, but never quite worked up the nerve. "Social situations have become complicated," Edwin admitted, with the careful phrasing of someone used to choosing his words precisely. Graham recognized the sentiment immediately. "I understand completely." They parted that day with tentative plans to walk together the following week. Nothing definite, just a mutual acknowledgement that the encounter had been pleasant rather than draining. But when Wednesday evening arrived, Graham found himself suggesting that Edwin might enjoy the reading program. And by Saturday, both men were regular attendees, bonding over their shared bewilderment at Noxley's ability to reduce sophisticated adults to cooing admirers. The crisis came without warning on a bitter Tuesday in late November. Graham woke to find Noxley's chair empty, the front door slightly ajar, despite his careful habit of checking all locks before bed. A thorough search of the house and immediate yard revealed nothing, and panic set in with surprising intensity. Graham hadn't realized how thoroughly Noxley had woven himself into the fabric of his daily existence until that fabric was suddenly torn. The house felt cavernous and lifeless without the cat's supervising presence, every familiar corner now highlighted by absence rather than comfort. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. His first instinct was to search alone, to handle the crisis with the same solitary determination that had characterized most of his adult problems. But Noxley had changed him in ways that ran deeper than he'd understood, and within hours, Graham found himself doing something that would have been unthinkable just months earlier, asking for help. The Facebook post felt like exposure of the most vulnerable kind, a public admission of how much the cat meant to him, complete with photos and a detailed description. But responses came immediately. Neighbors he'd never met offering to check their garages and sheds, members of the church reading group organizing search parties, even Mrs. Chen coordinating a phone tree to spread word throughout the extended community. Edwin appeared at his door within an hour of the post, armed with flashlights and a methodical search plan. Sarah arrived shortly after with printed flyers and contact information for local veterinarians and animal shelters. The outpouring of support overwhelmed Graham, who'd forgotten that communities could mobilize around individual crises with such speed and efficiency. The search continued for 3 days. Graham barely slept, sustained by coffee and the persistent kindness of people who had no obligation to care about his missing cat, but seemed genuinely invested in the outcome. He walked miles of unfamiliar streets, knocked on doors he'd never approached, and found himself explaining to strangers how much Noxley meant to him, conversations that forced him to articulate feelings he'd barely acknowledged to himself. "He's not just a pet," Graham found himself telling a concerned dog walker on Thursday evening. He showed me how to live again." The words surprised him with their accuracy. Somewhere during those months of shared routines and gentle companionship, Noxley had indeed taught him how to inhabit his life rather than simply endure it. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a homeless veteran named Marcus, who frequented the downtown area and had seen Graham's flyers taped to lampposts and store windows. Marcus approached Edwin during one of the organized search sessions, explaining that he'd noticed a silver cat, matching Noxley's description near the railroad tracks behind the old textile mill. "Didn't seem distressed," Marcus explained, "just sitting there like he was waiting for something. But that was yesterday morning and I haven't seen him since." The textile mill had been abandoned for decades, its broken windows and crumbling brick a testament to Charlottesville's industrial past. Graham and Edwin approached the building with the careful optimism of men who'd learned not to trust their hopes too completely. Flashlights cutting through the late afternoon shadows, they found Noxley in what had once been the mill's main office, curled up on a pile of old newspapers in a patch of sunlight, streaming through an intact window. He looked up at their approach with calm recognition, as if he'd been expecting them all along. "You impossible cat," Graham said, his voice thick with relief as he scooped Noxley into his arms. "Do you have any idea how worried we've been?" Noxley's purr suggested that worry had been unnecessary, that everything had proceeded according to plan. But as Graham held him close, feeling the solid warmth of his body and the familiar vibration of contentment, he realized that the crisis had served a purpose beyond mere feline adventure. For 3 days, Graham had lived outside himself, focused entirely on something he cared about more than his own comfort or pride. He'd accepted help from near strangers, made himself vulnerable in public forums, and discovered that the community he'd been avoiding was actually eager to embrace him. The experience had been terrifying and exhausting, but it had also been profoundly healing. The walk home was triumphant, with Edwin providing running commentary on Noxley's probable motivations, and Graham marveling at how different the familiar streets looked when viewed through eyes cleared by genuine fear and genuine relief. That evening, as Noxley settled back into his chair with the satisfied air of a diplomat returning from successful negotiations, Graham understood that their relationship had evolved into something deeper than companionship. They were partners now, bound not just by daily routine but by shared experience and mutual rescue. The cat had saved him, certainly, but Graham was beginning to realize that he'd saved the cat as well, not from physical danger, but from whatever circumstances had left such an obviously special animal wandering without a permanent home. They'd found each other when they both needed finding, and that synchronicity felt too meaningful to dismiss as mere coincidence. As he prepared for bed that night, Graham made a mental note to have Noxley microchipped and to update his veterinary records. Not because he doubted the cat's loyalty or intelligence, but because he finally understood that some relationships were worth protecting with every tool available. The test had been passed, the bond proven unbreakable. Now they could move forward together, whatever that future might hold. December in Charlottesville carried the kind of crisp promise that made even long-time residents remember why they'd chosen to stay. Graham found himself noticing the season's subtle beauties, the way frost outlined bare tree branches like silver calligraphy, the warmth of yellow light spilling from neighbors' windows, the satisfying crunch of leaves beneath his feet during his daily walks with Noxley. The letter to David had been sent 3 weeks ago, and while no response had arrived, Graham felt surprisingly peaceful about the silence. The act of reaching out had been its own reward, a declaration of his willingness to rebuild bridges, even if the other party wasn't ready to meet him halfway. Noxley, who had supervised the letter-writing process with typical feline oversight, seemed to approve of this philosophical evolution. The breakthrough came through the church reading program, though in a way Graham never could have anticipated. Sarah had approached him about participating in the community's annual Christmas storytelling event, a tradition where local residents shared personal narratives about hope, renewal, or unexpected gifts. "You don't have to decide right now," she'd said, after explaining the format. "But I keep thinking about your story with Noxley and how it might resonate with people who are struggling with their own isolation or grief." Graham's initial reaction was pure terror. Public speaking had never been his strength, and the idea of revealing personal details to a room full of near strangers felt like emotional exhibitionism. But Noxley, perched on his usual chair in the church fellowship hall, had fixed him with one of those steady amber gazes that seemed to communicate volumes about courage and possibility. The preparation process took weeks. Graham wrote and rewrote his remarks, crafting careful sentences about loneliness and redemption, while Noxley provided editorial oversight from his various supervisory positions around the house. Edwin proved invaluable as a practice audience, offering gentle feedback and the kind of encouragement that only comes from someone who understands the courage required to speak difficult truths aloud. "The story isn't really about the cat, is it?" Edwin observed during one of their rehearsal sessions. "It's about learning to trust again, to believe that connection is possible even after we've convinced ourselves we're beyond saving." Graham nodded, understanding for the first time why Sarah thought his experience might matter to others. Noxley's gift hadn't been miraculous. It had been persistently, patiently ordinary. Day after day of small kindnesses, gentle insistence, and unconditional presence that had gradually convinced Graham's guarded heart to venture back into the world. The evening of the storytelling event arrived with unusual warmth for December, as if the weather itself wanted to encourage attendance. The church fellowship hall was decorated with simple elegance: white lights, evergreen garlands, and candles that cast everything in the kind of golden glow that makes ordinary faces look luminous with possibility. Graham stood at the side of the small stage, Noxley calm in his arms, watching as the audience settled into their seats. He recognized many faces from the reading program, plus neighbors he'd gradually come to know during his months of tentative re-engagement with community life. Mrs. Chen waved from the third row. Marcus the veteran had claimed a seat near the back, and Edwin sat in the front with the encouraging smile of a friend who believes in your success even when you don't believe in it yourself. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah said, stepping to the microphone, "our final speaker tonight is Graham Ellison, and he's brought a very special co-presenter." Graham's legs felt unsteady as he approached the podium, but Noxley's warm weight against his chest provided an anchor point of calm. The cat surveyed the audience with his typical composure, as if public speaking was simply another item on their shared daily agenda. "6 months ago," Graham began, his voice stronger than he'd expected, "I was a man who had given up on almost everything. I'd lost touch with my family, avoided my neighbors, and convinced myself that isolation was safer than the risk of being hurt again." He paused, looking down at Noxley, who had settled into perfect stillness, as if he understood the importance of this moment. "Then this cat appeared at my gate, not asking for anything, not demanding attention, just sitting there with the kind of patience that made me curious, despite myself. I told myself I was just feeding him, that it was temporary, that I wasn't getting attached." A ripple of knowing laughter moved through the audience, the sound of people who recognized their own capacity for self-deception. But Noxley, that's his name, had different plans. He didn't just want food or shelter. He wanted me to remember how to care about something outside myself, how to open curtains and let light in, how to walk beyond my own property line, how to trust that the world might still have room for someone who'd made mistakes. Graham's voice caught slightly, but he pressed on, drawing strength from Noxley's steady presence and the rapt attention of faces turned toward him with genuine interest rather than judgment. "I learned that forgiveness, real forgiveness, doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small daily choices, the choice to feed a hungry animal, the choice to join a conversation instead of walking away, the choice to ask for help when something you love goes missing, the choice to stand here tonight and tell you that sometimes salvation comes on 4 paws, wearing a worn leather collar, with amber eyes that see straight through all your careful defenses." Noxley chose that moment to purr, a low rumble that the microphone caught and amplified, sending another wave of gentle laughter through the audience. "I'm not completely healed," Graham continued. "I'm still learning how to trust, how to connect, how to believe that my mistakes don't have to define my entire future. But I'm learning, and that's something I couldn't have imagined 6 months ago." He looked out over the audience, seeing nods of recognition and understanding, eyes bright with their own memories of unexpected grace. If you're someone who's built walls around your heart, if you've convinced yourself that you're beyond redemption or connection, I want you to know that healing can come from the most unlikely places. Sometimes it takes the form of a persistent cat who refuses to let you hide. Sometimes it's a neighbor who notices you're struggling. Sometimes it's a community that welcomes you back even when you're not sure you deserve welcome. As Graham concluded his remarks, the applause was warm and sustained, but what moved him most was the quality of attention in the room, not polite obligation, but genuine engagement, as if his story had touched something universal in the human experience of loss and recovery. After the formal program ended, people approached with their own stories of animal companions who'd provided comfort during dark times, of communities that had embraced them when they felt lost, of small kindnesses that had changed the trajectory of their lives. Graham found himself in conversations that felt natural rather than forced, connected by the shared understanding that everyone carries wounds and everyone needs witnesses to their healing. Edwin lingered as the crowd dispersed, helping Graham gather his notes while Noxley accepted final admirations from departing audience members. "That was beautifully done," Edwin said quietly. "Your story, it gave people permission to hope for their own second chances." Graham nodded, feeling simultaneously exhausted and energized by the evening's emotional exposure. But there was something else, a sense of completion that he hadn't expected. By sharing his journey publicly, he'd somehow claimed it fully as his own, transformed it from a private struggle into a testament to resilience that might encourage others. The drive home passed in comfortable silence, Noxley alert in the passenger seat as if reviewing the evening's events. As they pulled into Graham's driveway, he noticed something unusual, another car parked at the curb, its occupant's silhouette visible in the driver's seat. Graham's heart rate spiked as recognition dawned. He knew that profile, the particular way David held his shoulders when he was nervous or uncertain. His brother had come. Noxley remained calm as Graham parked, as if this development had been anticipated rather than hoped for. When David emerged from his car, the family resemblance was immediately apparent despite 2 years of separation. The same brown hair now touched with more grey, the same green eyes that had inherited their father's stubborn intelligence. "Graham," David said simply, his voice carrying years of accumulated regret and tentative hope. "David." Graham stepped out of his car, Noxley draped across his arms like a furry ambassador. "How did you—" "Mrs. Chen called me, said you'd written and that I should know you were speaking publicly tonight about forgiveness and second chances. She thought I might want to hear it firsthand." Graham made a mental note to thank his observant neighbor, whose network of community connections apparently extended far beyond his own awareness. "I got your letter," David continued, moving closer. "I've been carrying it around for weeks, trying to figure out what to say back. Then Mrs. Chen called and I realized maybe the response shouldn't be in writing." The brothers stood facing each other in the yellow glow of the streetlight, 2 years of hurt and pride creating an invisible barrier between them. But Noxley, with his uncanny ability to read social situations, jumped down from Graham's arms and walked deliberately to David, winding around his legs with the kind of welcome usually reserved for family members. "This must be the famous Noxley," David said, bending to scratch behind the cat's ears. Mrs. Chen had quite a lot to say about his transformative influence on the neighborhood. "He's been helpful," Graham admitted, understanding even as he said it that the word was entirely inadequate. They talked for over an hour, standing in Graham's driveway like teenagers reluctant to end a first date. The conversation meandered through apologies and explanations, updates on David's job and family, careful inquiries about Graham's well-being. It wasn't a complete reconciliation. That would take time and continued effort from both sides, but it was a genuine beginning, the first honest communication they'd shared in 2 years. "I'd like to stay in touch this time," David said, as he prepared to leave. "Regular contact, not just crisis management or holiday cards." "I'd like that too," Graham replied, and meant it completely. As David drove away, Graham scooped up Noxley and carried him inside, both of them somehow unsurprised by the evening's developments. The cat had orchestrated their entire relationship with the same patient persistence, the same faith in eventual positive outcomes. "Did you know?" Graham asked as they settled into their evening routine. "Somehow did you know this was all leading to tonight?" Noxley's amber eyes held their usual mysterious wisdom, revealing nothing and everything about his role in Graham's transformation. But as he settled into his chair, now officially designated as his chair, complete with a custom cushion Graham had ordered online, his purr carried the deep satisfaction of a mission accomplished. Graham understood finally that Noxley hadn't just saved him from isolation and despair. The cat had methodically, patiently guided him back to himself, the version of himself capable of connection, forgiveness, and hope. It had taken months of small steps, gentle insistence and unwavering faith, but the work was complete. He was home again, not just in his house but in his own life, ready to face whatever challenges and joys the future might hold, and he wouldn't be facing them alone. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, each flake catching the light from his windows, like tiny stars settling on a world made new by the simple, revolutionary act of letting love back in.